Good afternoon. I'm Martin Murray from the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. I'm convener of the British Art Network, which is supporting and hosting today's event. In a moment, I will hand over to Professor Paul Goodwin, who will be invited to devise and organise a programme exploring critical questions in British art curating. The result, Genealogies of Black Curating in Britain, starts with today's roundtable. The British Art Network is a professional network that aims to connect curators and create time and space for critical exchange and debate. It is supported by the Paul Mellon Centre, Tate and Arts Council England. If you have any questions about the network or any of the organisations associated with today's event, do provide your email address and a representative will respond to you after the event. Right now though, I am delighted to hand over to Paul.
Thank you, Martin. So a huge thank you and welcome to everyone today. I can see in the participants many people that I know and cherish. So great to see you. Great to see you here. Thank you for joining today. So a huge thank you to Martin and to Mark Hallett for asking me to do this project. I'm very pleased to really engage with the Paul Mellon Centre and the British Art Network, and also to the PMC, the Paul Mellon Network, Paul Mellon Centre team for their support. I'd also like to thank Rahila Haq for all her work with the project curation as we work with the panels and also with a series of films and interviews that will also be part of the overall package. So what I want to do before I introduce our fantastic panel today, I want to start by laying out the rationale and reasoning behind this project. So in the Genealogies of Black Curating project, I want to build on and extend out from much of the excellent art historical work that's been done on exhibition histories of Black art and on what we might call curating Black art. And the question I want to ask in this project is a subtle but important shift of emphasis in epistemologies, which I believe will require slightly different questions and slightly different methods. If Black art is now a relatively established category in British art, albeit a contested one, at least in terms of art historical recognition, how can we account for Black curating? Indeed, what is Black curating, if it is a thing? And how did it emerge in Britain? The project seeks to address this by investigating the emergence, strategies, and agency of Black curatorial practices in Britain over the past 40 years. My focus in this project is not on the histories per se, but it draws from the Foucaultian concept of genealogy, which emphasizes multiple origins, roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, and roots, R-O-O-T-S, discontinuities, and breaks rather than the smooth, linear unfolding of chronological time. The roots of Black curating are seen as being enmeshed, rhizomatic, entangled, and above all conjunctural in the terms articulated by Stuart Hall and David Scott. Black curating emerged from the problem spaces of the conjunctures of the post-war, post-colonial forces of economic crisis, viral racism, aesthetic and cultural exclusion of Black bodies and practices and institutions, and also transnational and diasporic connections and affiliations, which came together in Britain in the late 1970s and 1980s to produce not only what we now know as Black art, but also the subject of this series and the project, Black curating. So I'd like to make a couple of quick points about my initial thoughts on Black curating that I believe can help to frame this series and our discussion today. The term itself, Black curating, is arguably a contradiction in terms, given the terrible history of display and exhibitions in the West, where Black and brown people have historically been positioned as objects to be displayed and looked at. The exhibitionary complex that Tony Bennett has articulately written about was one of the many technologies of subjugation and terror used to humiliate, control, and indeed sell Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, from the dreadful exhibition of the slave auction block the public disciplinary displays of flogging of black and brown skin as methods of control and discipline, and the colonial exhibitions that actively used live black bodies and brown bodies and black models to stage reconstructions of African and Asian villages and even zoos in the metropoles of Paris, London, Brussels, etc. So I find myself asking, to what extent then has Black curating been an attempt to unravel and push back against this dreaded conundrum and contradiction? To what extent has Black curating used or co-opted the apparatus of the exhibitionary complex and turned it against itself, eking out alternative stories and histories of Black life and Black art that have been suppressed by that same exhibitionary complex? These are the kinds of key questions that's driving the series. So this was one of the principal arguments behind a recent exhibition in 2019 that I co-curated about the African-American intellectual and activist W.B. Du Bois's data charts, mapping African-American life in the Southern United States in the early 20th century, just a few years after the abolition of slavery, which was called W.B. Du Bois Charting Black Lives, which is at the House of Illustration in King's Cross in London. Now, the exhibition was a partial reconstruction of Du Bois's seminal exhibition in the American Pavilion at the 1900 World Exposition in Paris, showing for the first time in the UK, the exhibition showed for the first time in the UK, all 52 of the data charts used by Du Bois or produced by Du Bois in his research laboratory of Black graduate students at Atlanta University. One of the things about this project that was interesting to me was how marginal this exhibition, this particular exhibition, has been both in Black art histories and in the wider fields of exhibition and design histories, where it's only recently begun to be reconsidered and assessed in America, particularly in relation to Du Bois's wider work on Black life. This project helped me to think about Du Bois's role as a curator, facing the almost impossible challenge of how to picture and depict Black lives just 35 years after slavery, when Black people were still not accepted as being fully human. This pavilion was arguably the first time a Black curator presented images of Black life in a mainstream white museum and white supremacist space, writing and showing against the death table to which much of Black life was subjected. The history of exhibitions in the West up until that point was predicated on Black people as less than human, with images of Africans in human zoos and colonial subjection in the way that I've described. Now, arguably, this exhibition that Du Bois mounted in 1900 was one of the first decolonial exhibitions and the first time that a Black curator was able to present a more nuanced and rounded portrait of the complexity of Black lives based on data and research by Black knowledge producers. Du Bois was one of the first to begin to unpack the contradiction, the way that I'm framing it, the contradiction of Black curating, and place it at the heart of the white exhibitionary complex. Another source of my thinking of this was when I worked with Lubaina Himid on the exhibition Thin Black Lies at Tate Britain in 2012. When I approached Lubaina to work on display with me at Tate, I had been thinking about her practice as a curator of seminal exhibitions in London that showcased a variety of revolutionary works and practices by Black and Asian women in Britain that had been largely overlooked and ignored. This brought up two questions for me. Firstly, it brought up the fact that the central role that Black artists played in curatorial practice generally, and in particular during the explosion of exhibitions that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s around Black art. The Black exhibitionary impulse in Britain was definitely being driven by artists. And that's the first point that I really wanted to emphasize. And the second one is the vital role played by Black women artists and Black feminism in developing the exhibitionary impulse around Black art. And then thirdly, I think there was a diversity of practices that emerged around the staging of exhibitions, the building of archives and publications, the linking of activism and community, and the engagement with transnational and diasporic perspectives and partnerships that effectively, in my opinion, this is what I'm arguing, formed a new paradigm in the history of curating in Britain that has been until relatively recently completely unseen and unrecognized and unheralded. So this is the rationale behind the series and today's event, really to put that question of Black curating, that contradiction, that conundrum to the center, and to celebrate as well the contribution of Black curators and artists. So today's panel is called The Emergence of Black Curatorial Voice. It was the first in a series of 3 panels. And I'm absolutely thrilled today, really excited, because we've got an unbelievable panel of eminent and hugely influential artists who also curate. All of them, in my opinion, pioneers in the formation of Black curating in the way that I've just described. The panel will focus on the 1980s and early 1990s, when a variety of Black and Asian curatorial practices, projects, and spaces really came to light. The questions that we want to deal with are, how can we account for the emergence of Black curatorial practices at that time? How do we name them? And how did they transform the landscape of British art at the time? So let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. Our first speaker is Shaheen Merali, who's an independent curator and writer. And by the way, you can look at in the text you will have seen, or you'd have received the PDF which has all the information and the complete biographies of each speaker. But Shaheen Morali is an independent curator and a writer, and is currently a PhD candidate at Coventry University, where he's actually working on Black curating, which is really exciting. He's held positions at Central St. Martin's School of Art, a visiting lecturer and researcher at University of Westminster, and of course he was the head of Department of Exhibitions, Film, and New Media at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, the House of World Cultures in Berlin from 2003 to 2008. Where he curated several exhibitions that were accompanied by publications, including, of course, the Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, and other seminal exhibitions. He's the co-founder of the Panchayat Collection, an archive currently housed at Tate. After Shaheen's presentation, we'll be hearing from Rita Keegan. Rita Keegan is an artist, lecturer, and archivist, and among many other things, from the Bronx, who has lived and worked in London since 1980. Rita's work explores memory, history, dress, and adornment, often through the use of her extensive family archive, a photographic record of Black middle-class Canadian family from the 1890s to the present, an incredible archive. She co-founded, among many things, the Brixton Art Gallery in 1982. She established the incredible Women of Color Index in 1987, which is inspired, among other things, the Women of Color reading group, and was director of the African and Asian Visual Artists Archive, ARVA, until 1994. And of course, for many years, she was a lecturer in multimedia arts at Goldsmiths, and in fact, was one of the pioneers of multimedia art practice and the confluence of multimedia and Black art. And our final speaker, last but not least, is Hassan Aliyu, who is a prominent British Nigerian artist working in Britain. Born in Barnet, I love that in your bio, Hassan. Born in Barnet, but relocated to Nigeria as a child. Hassan studied at the influential Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, graduating as the best final year student in fine art in 1996. Returned to the UK in 1990. After returning to the UK in 1990, Hassan worked with the Caribbean Art Craft Circle in London, whilst he established his art practice in the UK. He joined the 198 Gallery as curator in 1992 and co-founded the Norwood Art House in 1996. Hassan is also president of the Nigerian Art Society UK and works from his studios and private gallery in Rainham, Essex, which I encourage everyone to visit. It's in a really amazing space. It's actually a functioning gallery space in his back garden. His recent projects include the International Touring Exhibition, Legacies of Biafra, which originated at the Brunei Gallery in London at SOAS, and he's currently doing a practice-based PhD in fine art at the University of East London. So each speaker, how will we do this? So each speaker will present for approximately 10 minutes, we hope. But it may be a bit longer, we aren't sure. We will have a short 10-minute break after their presentations, which will be followed by around a 40-minute conversation between the panelists where I will kind of ask them some questions around the development and the emergence of those practices. And then we will hopefully be able to have at least 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So please do use the Q&A function and the chat function to leave your questions. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask our first speaker, Shaheen Merali, to grace us with his wisdom. And Shaheen will start his presentation with a video. Shaheen, over to you.
In 1974. It's a strike in defense of basic trade union rights, and lined up against us on the other side is all those elements in this country that would like to see us be driven back to a position that we were in 100 years ago. First and foremost, it's about trade union rights, but it's also about the exploitation of immigrant workers in this country. Let me just say one point on that. The National Association of Freedom picked on the wrong people this time. But they not only picked upon one of the bravest groups of strikers they have moved the scene for a long time, they've now picked upon our entire trade union movement.
After 10 months on the picket line, while ACAS, APEX and the TUC vainly attempted to get George Ward to see reason, the strikers organised a series of mass pickets, leading to a call with the miners for a mass picket of solidarity on July the 11th, 1977.
Hey Robbie, where you going? In the middle of the night, I'm going down to London, to the bloody Cranwick site, where a wee small band of immigrants are fighting for their rights. So put your coat on, Jimmy lad, and come and join the fight. Hold the line, hold the line.
I wanted to begin my opening statement by paying homage to the community that came before us in the 1980s. In a recent conversation with Rita, Keegan, and listening to John O'Comfrey and Trevor Matheson discussing Black audio, it became even more evident as to the work that had already been carried out by those who preceded us. One thing that always needs to be acknowledged is the work that preceded us. I wanted to start by re-entering those generational struggles, for their work, which they had undertaken, is still provoking reflection. For us to be able to produce these vernacular insights and archives that are unraveling and rebuilding, their ethical protocols provide a continuing dialogue that questions the perceptions of our politicized identities. The Brunswick Affair by Dennis Bobo, recorded in 1977, the year when the Brunswick strike took place over an extensive period in West London. In many ways, the period we are about to engage with today and throughout the conference is predicated on the residue of that first generation migrants. Their role in and out of British institutions and the writers, painters, composers, and performers that emerged in the axis of those instances. the ex-Commonwealth, whose own earlier fundamental rites of passage were those of whose parents belonged to the Windrush generation or were forced into exile by President Idi Amin from Uganda. The 2.5-minute collage of Denis Bovell's Brunswick strike over the footage of the strikers facing the thick blue line of the police establishment acts as a portal, an image of the community out of which political Black art emerged and resonated. I would like to thank Leah Rustamji for editing the 2 moments of subjugation and reflection into one edit. I would also like to thank Paul Goodwin and Rahila Haq, and to say how much I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the essential work currently being undertaken by the British Art Network and the Tate on the emergence of political Black curatorial voices and transnational perspectives in British art since the 1980s. I would like to begin by stating that when I use the term political Black art, often shortened to Black art, it differs from the current use of the term Black art, which only refers to artists of African descent. In the British context, the history and legacies of the term political Black, which began to be circulated in the late 1970s and early 80s, became central to the critical decade, a term coined in the essay by David A. Bailey and Stuart Hall, as an invaluable guide to the multiplicity of practices and concerns of political Black cultural activists. Black art by the mid-1980s mirrored these early stages of globalization as a movement in which artists from African and Asian descent created works which often recontextualized the place, people, histories, and philosophies of the global majority, from which they themselves had emerged. Political Black art brought into the public sphere the opportunity to be comprehensive about epistemic diversity and embodied knowledge, as well as artists' experiences in British society and of British history and global art history. While their legacy partially remains an enduring force, one that is parallel to the development of the young British arts, the YBAs, its impact on art historical discourses and artistic and curatorial practices remains understudied as part of contemporary culture. In context of this talk and other recent talks which have been organized about archives and collections, I find myself continually drawing on my experiences as an artist curator who co-founded with Alan D'Souza, Panchayat Arts Resource Unit in London in 1988. A 15-year engagement prefixed by collecting, cataloging, and maintaining an artist and curatorial hub that produced several exhibitions, publications, workshops, conferences, and research. Emerging from higher education, the speculative production in the political Black arts practice questioned the validity of knowledge as a form that remained and still remains part of the demand by corporate, privatized, commercial, and academic sectors. Collectively, these challenges at different stages of an artist-led organization, Panchayat enabled a pragmatic understanding that emerges from exhibition making and in engaging local and regional communities. The understanding of ourselves as emerging from a global majority, often referred to the Southern world or previously the Third World, created an open, even democratic space that underpinned the ambition to undertake international or even national touring exhibitions. In the first year working as Panchayat, 1988 to 1989, I negotiated and further curated the participation by 5 Black artists from England for the 3rd Havana Biennale. In May 1989, I participated in the Feria Internacional de Artesiana in Havana, where I met the curators and the directors of the Havana Biennale, who had almost completed their research for the forthcoming Biennale to be held in late October of 1989. I entered a discussion with curators, including Gerardo Mosquero, as well as one of the founders of the Biennale and its director, Lilian Lanes, at the Center of Contemporary Art, Wilfredo Lam. From this conversation, I better understood and realized the ambition of the 3rd Havana Biennale, one that reflected our struggles and one which was empathetic for once to our being. I realized to a certain extent in talking with these curators who had crisscrossed the whole global South, including sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia, to bring back to Havana the fertile artistic imagination from the Southern world. May 1989, at that point, seemed fated for Cuba. One already felt the failings of the arrangements with the USSR was begetting a desperate void. The economic zone becoming sluggish, trade was mutating into tourism, the supermarkets empty of fresh food and produce, a social utopia found itself surviving on increasing limitations. This wasn't really far from a condition which I had emerged from in East Africa, for instance. Limitations always guarded against, and conditions which we fought against, which were dependent on sometimes Britain or sometimes the Northern world. The discussions with the curators and other artists in Havana proved fruitful and concluded with arrangements to organize the participation of an informal group of Black and Asian artists living and working in London in the Third Havana Biennale. At that time, I had also visited the experimental graphics workshop, and it became obvious how Cuban artists were having to survive with less materials to produce their own art. And out of these conversations which happened in Cuba, I managed to work with a group of those artists to produce an exhibition called Revolution Eyes, which was subsequently held at the 198 Gallery in Brixton in October 1989 as well. So, and it featured a great number of really interesting, important artists which we'd never heard of or even have heard of them afterwards. The 80s, to some extent, was times of great opportunities that could be agreed with the formality of a handshake. I left Havana with the task of solidifying an exhibition that I'd already researched for the Leatherby Gallery at Central St. Martin's School of Art in London. As an artist and exhibition organizer with the early interest in curating and disseminating information, maybe it rose from the fact that I'd been born in Tanzania, East Africa, and arrived in London at a young age. And I had extensively traveled to India, which inspired me to work and sort of reach globally. And maybe it was the implications of working globally, which was part of my life, that allowed me to these early experiments of exhibition making, not only for my own work, but for the community which I felt I was part of and was relating to. The exhibition that I curated as the participation with great help, with great amount of help from Alan, as well as from Patika and Thuli, included the work of both Alan, myself, Sonia Boyce, Patika and Thuli, and Keith Piper. This exhibition remains one of the sort of like solid evocation of what could have been done and can still be done through, although we face an increasing amount of and historical challenges which still remain embedded in infrastructures around Britain or in the world. Between 1990 and 1992, I also co-organized a gallery and workshop in North London called One Spirit Gallery in the borough of Haringey, where I presented solo exhibitions by Shaida Kumari Berman, Tam Joseph, but also group exhibitions, including one about jazz in Soweto in South Africa, and an exhibition of self-taught artists with disabilities. And all of this congregated in a sense to build, was a way to build and encourage a more democratic and representative culture field in the UK and internationally. And simultaneously, I started recording and collecting ephemera, as was Alan, to create files of our activities. And this became the basis of Panchayat Arts Education Resources in East London. And we started to work towards curating Crossing Black Waters, an exhibition by 13 South Asian artists, which I will try and talk about later on. Now I'd like to hand over from my initial remarks to Rita Keegan's initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaheen. That was memory lane. I came from, as Paul said, I was born in the Bronx. My father was Canadian. My mother was from the Caribbean, Dominica. And I was, at a very early age, it was decided I was a gifted child. And obviously it was about art, and started going to art school very early. In New York, you always, especially as a person of color, you always had the shadow of the Harlem Renaissance. But I went to a high school called Art and Design, and it was in Midtown Manhattan. And I would walk from one end of the Manhattan to the other, going from, on 57th Street and going into all the galleries, and these, I didn't have the sense to know that these were places that I wasn't supposed to go. And every gallery I walked into, or every space I walked into, I seemed to be welcomed. I mean, granted, I did have a great big portfolio, so that might have given them the idea that I was an artist or trying to be. But this is at 16 and on up. So I knew it was a space that I could inhabit. Also, my uncle was an artist. He turned out that he lived here from the 50s to the 60s. And so I never questioned me as a maker. But also as a maker, it was assumed that as the great God curator would come down and select your work and put your work on show, and your career would begin from there. So when I finally came to England in the late 70s and in the early 80s, I was excited, because at that point, the art world was really exceptional with funding. There were galleries, all sorts of places. There wasn't necessarily a hierarchy of community art, but of making and creating. And granted, there was a year that Margaret Thatcher got in, and I didn't realize that it would all change. But just being able to create work, and I got a small grant from Lambeth Arts, and then I heard that some people had set up a gallery in a couple of the old carpet shops, and I thought, well, I got a grant, they got a grant, let me go see what they're like. And I got involved in the Brixton Art Gallery, and it came out of a Brixton festival, which was in response to one of the previous uprisings. And there it was, people themselves were hanging work. It was, you had open shows. What was exciting about the gallery is there wasn't a hierarchy of work, whether you were self-taught or university or large-scale installations, performance art. So you had a diversity of art practice, and by the nature of where it was, you had a diversity of people. The gallery was 3 railway arches right in the middle of the market. So people would literally take their groceries shopping, because you could cut through from one end to the next. And there I learned how to hang work. And I always call it, my dad has a barn, let's put on an exhibition. And you learned the demystification of exhibitions. You learned about hanging, you learned about catalogs. Also, you learned about, documenting and making your own catalog, which was generally in photocopy. But there were other artists, and they discussed different issues. It was the rise of feminism. And and those wonderful books like Old Mistresses were coming out. So you had all this text happening, and that you could go into. But I guess also being Black, I also knew about women artists and Black artists in the States. I had stumbled into the exhibition of Harlem on My Mind. I mean, that was a whole nother experience. But I was always going to galleries, and I never really equated myself with a curator, because there's someone else. I'm an artist, and I put on shows, and also it was about the shared experience of putting on work and taking responsibility for your craft, for your creativity, and not expecting someone to control your process. And along with that came the ephemera that you created. There was also a great understanding that if you did not document yourself and document the work of people around you, that work would disappear. And so it was also one of those things that we felt very, very keen to do, was to document our work. And whether that was collecting A5 photocopies, exhibition, what we would loosely call catalogs, and all the other paper that was handed out, because there was no cell phones, and computers you didn't have access to computers. You produced it was fanzine culture, basically. You had your letter set, and you produced your stuff, and you handed out leaflets. And those leaflets ended up staying. And I'm sort of an accidental curator. I'm also an accidental archivist, because those pieces of paper became so critical to what you were doing. And they can all be put in a folder or in a little plastic sheet. So when I was going through my papers, I realized I had the invitation for showing, I had the correspondence about the space, I probably had how much it was going to cost, and then I would have the private view card piece of paper, or the flyer that went out. So I ended up having a half a dozen sheets of paper that could then end up forming an archive. And if you put them all in a book, you end up having 30 years of work. And those are proof that we were here, and proof that we can do. And it's important not to just be perceived as a muse, but to be your own muse. And from there, I would like to hand back to Hassan, who is going to speak about his practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. I'm very pleased to be here, and my name is Hassan Aliyu. I started my career as an artist in Nigeria, as Paul mentioned earlier, having graduated from Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria. In those days, there were no curators. The artist was on their own, basically, to sort of run the method and create the avenues through which they showed their work. Added to that fact was also that there were no galleries. So from very early on in the mid-80s, I actually created my own gallery space in my house. I have maintained that model for showing my work since. But in addition to showing my work through my own avenue, I've also taken on the responsibility for showing or for building viable artist communities. So over the years, I've worked extensively, and I've been an active member, and in fact also a member of the management committee of the Society of Nigerian Artists in Lagos. I came to London in 1990, having been invited to come to do a show at the Westbourne Gallery in Westbourne Grove, which at the time was run by Sonny McNulty. And I was invited by Emmanuel Jegede, who had been based here from the 60s. Emmanuel came to Nigeria, where I had two exhibitions ongoing simultaneously, one at the National Museum in Lagos and one at the National Gallery of Arts and Culture, both in Lagos. So when I came to London, I came having been born in London and gone back to Nigeria while as a child, I came back to London with a lot of hope and aspiration that London was better infrastructurally developed, more galleries, more opportunities for artists. But what I found was totally contrary. So rather than dwell in self-pity or sort of change my career at the age of 24, I decided that I was going to found an art organization, and I did that too, called the Society of Contemporary Nigerian Artists in the UK. So quite soon, we wrote a proposal to the Federation of British Artists, and we were granted an exhibition at the Mall Gallery. We then spent the next few months looking to raising the rental costs for the spaces for the gallery, which we were given, which cost £1,800, £1,800 a day, which in 1991 was a lot of money. Before that, I had worked at the Caribbean Craft Circle, where I was not only cataloging an archive of artwork by Black and Asian, African and Asian artists, or Afro-Caribbean artists as the term was at the time. I was doing that as well as looking around for other ways in which to exhibit my work privately. So 198 Gallery was suggested to me. And in fact, I'd found out about the gallery, which had opened in 1988. In fact, the opening exhibition entitled Contemporary Art, Afro-Caribbean Artists showed a number of artists who are still working today, one of whom is on this panel, Shaheen Merali, of course. And so basically, when I joined 198 Gallery, which had been founded by Zoe Linsley Thomas, it was basically 2 rooms where Zoe and I pretty much did everything that needed doing. Other people had volunteered and had worked at the 198 before my time, but I came in as an artist, as a curator. It's significant in the realization that most of the landmark changes that occurred in the art scene in London and in the UK generally from the 80s through the 90s and in fact to today were driven by artists who worked as curators. The sort of professional curator did not exist at that time, to the best of my knowledge. So the other story was curated by Rashida Rain. Eddie Chambers was doing great work. And there were so many others, Shaka Dedi, and so many others, Shaheen Merali, doing this work of sort of, providing visibility and access to the work made by Black people. So that's where I came into. There wasn't a viable commercial setup that was open to Black artists, and largely within the mainstream art world, which was known by the time, which were more, I suppose, commercially viable, Black artists were marginalized. I had instances where I actually approached venues to hire space to show my work, so actually paying them to show my work as well as work by the other artists who I had founded my group with. And basically, they expressed the view to me that it might affect the perception by their clientele. And so therefore, even though I was willing to pay, it was a blackout nonetheless. So that's the environment I found. There were differences, different situations to Nigeria. First of all, when I came, Nigeria was in the throes of a military dictatorship. So an artist expressing themselves or an exhibition which would be curated to sort of reflect things that might be objected to by the prevailing dictatorship just wasn't on. And also in London at the time too, Margaret Thatcher was cutting funding for various organizations which were not commercially viable, such as the Caribbean Craft Circle, which came to an end as a result of loss of its funding from the GLC. Since then, I've continued to make my work. I set up the, I curated a number of exhibitions at the 198 Gallery, a good few, which we will discuss in the course of this conversation. But also, after my 198 experience, I set up the Norwood Art House, which was an artist project founded by myself, as well as Raymond Watson, a sculptor. And we were strictly looking for opportunities to earn a living through our work, as well as provide services of an education nature to re-inform on the motivations and of our practice. Following that, in later years, I set up the Nigeria Art Society UK. And amongst we have an exhibition every year, which is curated largely by me and one or two colleagues. And most of the subject matter or the themes are based on the current situation of Nigeria from the diaspora. Our ongoing exhibition, Legacies of Biafra, which is a touring exhibition, which originated at the Brixton Art Gallery in London, and it's touring to the Gallery Oldham in Greater Manchester, as well as later on to Ivaleva House in Bayreuth, is curated by Dr. Luisa Igbonike, who is currently at Durham University. So basically, my commitment to developing and to supporting the development of Black art and art by Black artists, is been an ongoing commitment in my life. So in my space in Rainham, as Paul mentioned earlier, I have exhibitions and discussions regularly that sort of deal on the subject matter of race, of identity. And those particular areas are the areas of my interest as a curator. That said, my time at the 198 Gallery, which fits into the time frame for this conference, was not necessarily based on my own sort of disciplines and commitments, because 198 Gallery was a space set up by Zoe Linsley Thomas in 1988, because she was looking for a way in which to not let her daughter, Danielle Aqua, suffer the marginalization that was abound at that time for Black artists who didn't have a space to display their work. So 198 had a very open door kind of policy, even though that said, the quality of the exhibitions were paramount. It was partly funded, so it's the exhibitions had to be, to an extent, commercially viable, because without the commerce, then the space would cease to exist, as the Caribbean Craft Circle ceased to exist. It's 30 years ago's memories, so I should try to sort of recall as much as I can in the course of this conversation, but right now I'm going to hand back to Paul. Thank you.
Okay, wow. I mean, I think that, thank you so much, Hassan, Shaheen, and Rita. I think we really got into the materialities of curating as a craft, the politics at the time, etc. So what we're going to do now is just ingest that mass of incredible information for 10 minutes. We're going to have a break for 10 minutes, and we're going to reconvene roughly around 3 o'clock. And then I will get into some discussions and questions, digging into those archives that we just heard. So can I call our wonderful panelists to come back into the conversation after what I thought was a wonderful panoply of practices, of archives, of memories, but also of textures about the emergence of Black curatorial was. I want to thank you all for those wonderful contributions. I kind of picked up in particular, in no particular order, something that Rita said, which was that artists need to take responsibility for their work. It was a craft. I think the phrase you used was, you know, taking responsibility for your craft. You know, the sense of the materiality of curating, of artistic practice. And I think curating, in that sense, what artists brought to that was a sense of a craft, of actually getting down, doing the nitty gritty, the putting up the work on the walls, the way that you described, Rita, the experience at Brixton Art Centre, the kind of non-hierarchical sense, the ways in which, you know, artists, you learnt, it was a learning process of learning how to put work up, how to do work, etc. And and I got that from all of you. In a sense, it was a moment before the curators like me and others, you know, came along, and that perhaps Shaheen morphed into, perhaps Shaheen, I'm just joking, but you know, before the kind of curators came in to tell you how to do this and do that and do this. So there's this moment of the emerging of curatorial practice and artistic practice where it became one. It was about urgency. That's one thing that came out. The other thing I wanted to start with really is to go back. We can come on to that a little bit later, the craft aspect. But I wanted to start with the context of the time, which I thought Shaheen brilliantly brought in with that amazing Dennis Bovell soundtrack and the video, the juxtaposition between the kind of, you know, reggae, the dub soundtrack at the time, which, you know, it absolutely dominated the airwaves and everyone remembered those moments, and the Brunswick protest and strike, where Asian women were at the center of that movement and taking agency and radical kind of. So it was a kind of moment of Afro-Asian unity, and large and more broadly, there was a kind of global moment, a kind of moment of the quote third world, which I think was really important. So I wanted to start really with let's kind of revisit this moment of the third world, Afro-Asian community, Afro-Asian unity, Brunswick, this international context. Shaheen mentioned about the Havana Biennale. So my question is, what role did international contexts play in your practices at the time? And I'd like to start with Shaheen.
All right. You know, in sense, one was constantly amongst groups of artists who had the same or similar ideas about the politics which they faced within Britain. And out of it, I would say that there was emerging what we could say is a Black British radical tradition that included an understanding of the bitter fights which were going on politically and in schools and in community centers, in housing, in unemployment, and in police stations, where a lot of people were dying and killed. So someone like A. Shivanandan and the Institute of Race Relations was part of that structure that challenged ideas about what was emerging politically, let's say, but that which entered our exhibition making in allowing us to have an understanding of who we were, in a sense, standing against, or what we were standing against. For instance, the Whitechapel at one point put out this idea of an exhibition called Coming from Two Worlds. This idea that we were otherworldly, literally, that we were not from the same world. And this is in the middle of the Bengali community that they were surrounded by. So the Whitechapel itself created a wall where we understood ourselves and were called non-Europeans, even if we were born here. So the idea, and we took on this idea of the non-European. And all of a sudden, now Britain has become non-European. And we took on this otherness as something that was given to us by funding agencies and institutions like the Arts Council. They created these categories to be able to literally work with us. Now, that's a start, but I would also say that we were supported in our understanding by writings which emerged around the notion of the post-filiation, for instance. And what I mean by that is even a disaffiliation, which comes out of the work of Edouard Glissant, when he talks about a genealogy, which is outside of the traditional Western and outside of the binary of the Western and non-Western. So we were having to take on ideas about how we're having to recreate ourselves in the scenarios that we were facing on a daily encounters with the state and its institutions, including its museums, its collections, its art history, and even in our art colleges. All of us around this table who studied in Britain faced a hell lot of discrimination about our work. And
I mean, what I would like to say is that we were already we were already international. And most of us came from different places. And even if the Black British people that were born here, I had friends that were Nigerian and Jamaican. I had friends that, you know, so they had already traveled. So it wasn't like you're talking about, none of us were provincial. None of us had the luxury of being provincial. And not that everybody was urban or from the cities, but even if you weren't from the cities, you still had a duality of cultures, possibly the culture that you grew up in and how you negotiated the world you were living in. So you always had to look at a very complex, duality doesn't even do it justice. So it didn't occur to us not to be international.
I completely agree with that. You know, and I think this what I would call transnational dimension, I think was actually a signal contribution of Black British artists to British art at that time. I mean, think about how parochial Britain was at the time. I mean, come on. I mean, think about London in 1989 or whatever, 1980s. I mean, extremely parochial. I mean, Hassan, for you coming from Nigeria, coming back, you know, being born in Barnet, you know, going to Amadou Bello University, coming back to London. I mean, what was that kind of like in terms of what was the Britain that you encountered when you came back, you know?
The Britain I came to had a significant number of Nigerians. We had established Nigerian communities. So it wasn't like I was in a strange place. But there were these sort of categories and compartments that those people existed within, and they couldn't break beyond that social strata that they existed in. So the art also was, you know, sort of contained within that same compartment where the Nigerian communities were. Britain is an international space. We as former colonial subjects, I'm British by birth, but my parents is colonial subjects who came here in the 50s, and people came just after the war to help Britain, you know, sort of repair the country after the damage of Second World War. I mean, the children don't have any other sense of home. So Britain's a melting pot of very many nations and nationalities. So you would expect, or I would expect, that the art would also be open in that way to that sort of multi-mixture of ethnicities and nationalities.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to also move the conversation on to think about place. Now, obviously, Brixton emerges as a really important place, particularly in the trajectory of Rita and Hassan, and also, you know, Shaheen also showed exhibitions, was part of exhibitions in Brixton. You know, what was the importance of London at that point? So I've got 2 parts to this question. One, why did Brixton emerge as this really important centre of Black British art and Black British creativity and Black British radicalism in the wake of the riots? But then secondly, I wanted to also ask you about, because I'm also aware of the fact that the way that I've curated this symposium is very much London based, which is really bad. And Shaheen, I know you're involved with a project that I'm also involved in, which is looking at the Midlands as the rightful centre of Black British art, actually initiates the Black British art discourse. But I was wondering, for all of you, were you aware of Black art practices outside of London? Did you visit Midland? Did you go to other places in the north or whatever? So two parts to that question. One is Brixton as a place and why it was important, and the second part is like, what about the rest of the country? Shaheen?
All right, so Brixton was a front line as such. That's where the line was drawn to a large extent. That's where the holding pen was, in a sense. Creation for Liberation, Black Art Gallery, Brixton Art Gallery, 198 Gallery, It's where CLR James was. You know, there was a lot of different things going on for Brixton at one point. It sort of moved from Notting Hill to Brixton in many ways, and further on, I would argue to a certain extent, the front line moved outside the South African embassy in Trafalgar Square, because it was redrawn by the fact that the embassy, there was a large group of protests, 24 hours a day, which took place for a very long period of time, which also created a specific zone of activities and understanding and knowledge. People like Patika and Thuli was involved there, and so was Antoinette. A lot of people sort of moved between those. So Brixton was, yes, very important, but so were certain areas in Bristol, in Newport, in Cardiff. They were also encased by the spectre of violence which had come through. And of course, you know, a lot of the exhibitions, let's say, that Eddie worked on, and also the exhibition that myself and Alan curated, Crossing Black Waters, took place at the South London Gallery, but it started in Leicester City Art Gallery. It went to Oldham, and it went to Bradford. So, and we were in touch with all of these people involved in Bradford and in Leicester and Oldham. And a number of times, of course, the exhibitions that Eddie did were around Bristol, at the Arnolfini, and then in Liverpool. So there was an incredible regional regionality as such, a community that developed, a network that developed in facing and looking at the differences, but also the similarities of how we were staged, or the staging of Black art and the complexities that it brought forth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with Brixton Art Gallery, it was an umbrella. It was a huge space. And also, so it was, and we ridiculously did a show a month. So that's a lot. And also we worked with other people. I remember when Eddie and Donald came down, and I think Keith Piper too, and Maxine came down to the space to look at it, because it was a space in London. You know, obviously you have to show in London. And, you know, it opened itself up to many things, but also you could get the shows, but getting the art critics and art spaces. A lot of people moved on from the Brixton Art Gallery. Mona Hatoum, and a lot of people have shown there and just ignored it at that and the 198. But I mean, one of the shows that I curated, and I'm using that word curated, was, I know it's hard to own that one. I can own Black, I can own colored, but curator is one of the problematic ones I have. And it was the Black Women's Exhibition, I think our first, and the review said, a carnival of color and a riot of textiles. Now, excuse me, and it was a good review, but those were the only words and they thought they must have been really clever to end it with that. But they could not separate those two words with a Black art show. A riot and a carnival. They got it there. They managed to get them both in. But that's the kind of thing that even it doesn't matter your scholarship in what you were showing and what you were doing. The mainstream found a way to maybe saying dehumanize is going too far, but it's not that much further. So, you know, you end up doing work that has to be viewed by the canon in a specific way, because that's the only way. You know, you move from doing textile work to doing installation. You move from painting to doing installation. Not that you don't still paint, but you move because you can get shows that way and your work is looked at differently. I had a show at the ICA And it was a multimedia show. It was an installation. And I got invited to go on Start the Week, and I'm sitting there with Melvin Bragg, and he's asking me all sorts of questions. But, you know, I realized, and I said, my subject matter has not changed. It's still my family, it's still people of color, but what's changed is the medium. And the medium was the thing that got the work looked at. It had nothing to do with what was on the screen. And I found that interesting, but it is also how that the center deals with what you produce. So it had no problem with my little black faces, because it was so seduced by the medium, the new.
Yeah, yeah. I want to move on a little bit because we are kind of pushing on for time. I want to talk a little bit about the terminology used at the time around curating. And I'm gonna ask Hassan to kind of kick off on this. You know, Hassan, actually, when you joined the 198, you were appointed as a curator. Now, at the time, or at least before then in the 80s, you know, the word selector was often used, particularly by artists, you know, like Eddie Chambers, Lubena Hamid, and others, who selected other artists to work. Or even the term keeper was often a kind of word. But, you know, curator kind of emerged a bit later on. For example, when I worked at the Tate, even in as late as 2006, 2007, you know, Tate had recently adopted the term curator for a range of practices. Now, I guess, how did you inhabit that term, Hassan? I mean, what did curating mean to you, if anything? I mean, you know, how did that sort of equate to what you were doing at the time?
Just to be clear, when I joined the 198, I had initially had an exhibition. This was in 1992. At the time, the 198 was run by Julian Brutus. And when Julian Brutus left or was made to leave, Zoe Linsley Thomas came back. She had had a heart attack and had left the gallery 2 years before. Before she came back, the job of gallery administrator was advertised. I was shortlisted along with Zoe to the interview. We both did the interview. She got the job. But right after she was employed as a director, she asked me if I would work with her to help her organize the exhibitions, because there was this conversation right after the meeting, and she realized that I came along with some experience of this space in terms of organizing art exhibitions. There was no job title at the time. However, when complimentary cards were printed, it had the title of curator. With my job at the 198 Gallery, I did everything from helping to keep the place clean, to the physical exhibition making and writing press releases, biographies of artists, developing the exhibition catalog, and organizing the press days and trying to get the media to come along for the show, as well as selling the artwork. So those were my roles. And rightly, as you say, the term curator did not apply until much later. And I think that term came into use after Africa 95, because Africa 95 is the first time that I personally saw a huge influx of non-artist type Black people who were curators running different aspects of the program. Hitherto, most of the curators, to my knowledge, were artists or stakeholders who were more closely attached from both the creative and the practice aspects of art and exhibition making than others. During that time also, as a matter of fact, before Africa 95, I was out on the market looking for a job to support myself and to continue to make my work. Most of the jobs I saw which were suited to my experience were advertised as exhibition officer. So the term curator was quite a new terminology that came into existence, to the best of my knowledge, around about that Africa 95 period. So the 198 Gallery always strove to have a seat at the important tables where discussions and decisions were being had, right? So I think that was maybe the impetus for having a curator. So when we went to the Royal College to see the work of Faisal Abdullah and Chris Ofili and Maria Amidou, and then we went to Goldsmiths to see Steve McQueen's work and Georgina Evans, we needed to present that we had a curator, and that was me. So it evolved rather than was a role that I was employed to do, if you see what I'm saying.
I remember, I can't remember the year, but I was on Arts Council project and panel, and that would have been in the 90s. And they decided to start a curator course. One was at Goldsmiths, one was at the Royal College, and one was at where's Keith teaching?
Middlesex.
Middlesex. So those three places started the curator course. But also there were very different initiatives that the Arts Council put forward, where they invited, or people applied to be to work alongside a gallery and a curator, and these would have been in the 90s, in the early 90s. I did work on the curators course with old brain, bad names, Kettle's Yard. She used to work at Kettle's Yard. She did a square. Who?
Nairn.
No, not Sandy. Sandy was really supportive.
The other brother.
Andrew Nairn.
No, Sandy was fantastic in terms of those initiatives. The name, I'll scream the name out later, and she'll kill me because I can't remember.
No problem. We'll get that.
No, but so there was courses.
Yeah.
That, and I was amazed because I did teach on one, but there was it was all very metaphysical and not necessarily about the reality of your budget and your funding, and it was about it was again about the curator as star.
Yeah.
And there was this whole period of time where you went into an exhibition and you barely saw the work because the curator had decided to do lots of text and a little tiny piece, And I wanted to say, well, just be an artist, you just, so there was the curator as star.
By the way, Mike Tooby says that maybe you're thinking of Anna Harding.
Yes, definitely, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Anna, forgive me.
Yeah.
I love you.
That's. I mean, you're making a really interesting distinction, Rita, and also Hassan, in the way that, because I mean, as a curator myself, not a trained artist, I'm aware of the problematic ways in which curating has become this dominant force within contemporary art, and it frames artist practices. And looking back at that time when there was a much more freedom, I love doing your presentations because it was a sense of taking responsibility. I mean, Rita used the term taking responsibility for your work. Showing your work, the materiality of curating, and creative became much more conceptual and about the curator as author. Which I mean, there've been fantastic curators, of course, and exhibitions that have come, but I think that period showed that there was a potentiality for much more grounded and I think radical exhibition that I think you all were involved in. Let me move on because we are moving on in time.
Can I just
go ahead, please, Shaheen? Of course.
Sorry. A tiny bit. Sorry, I just think that we moved from a time of negotiated arrangements within a specific network to a professionalization in the arts, which was pushed by the Arts Council.
Exactly.
all right? We go back to the same old in terms of how our abilities of contestations were then stabilized by forums such as networking, audience management, curating, and this notion of professional development was used as a means of influencing the public, which is what art was used as a way to do that to a large extent. What it didn't realize to some extent that exhibitions and maybe workshops and allied activities were only a part of the arrangements that these people like both Hassan and Rita and many others were involved in. They were also involved in setting up refugees or refuge centers or working with refuge centers. They were sometimes working with youth centers. They were working with making posters, especially at Copy Art, which was in London, was very important, or involved in book launches or in seminars, or as Rita has also mentioned, working with policy documents for the Arts Council. And sometimes maybe even involved in setting up conferences or concerts, like Rock Against Racism concerts, or in melas, especially in Nottingham and Bradford and places like that. So there was a plethora of activities which were going on, which the curator, in a sense, was taken out of. So all of that embeddedness, which was community work, or seen as community work, was really just left aside as not being of importance.
Well, I mean, you still did it.
Oh yeah, you were involved.
I mean, but also it was, you had to departmentalize what you were doing. And you also had to put aside things for funding. If you wanted to pay your rent, or you wanted to do a project, you had to make your project fit. It was a awful chicken and egg thing, but it didn't stop you from ultimately we weren't separated from our communities or our projects, and I helped set up Copy Art, so it was you and with people like Alan D'Souza, you did your own art, but you also helped do that flyer for for whatever issue that needed to be done.
I mean, the key word is that we entered a hierarchy within which we had to submit to get funding, and that funding was actually counter public culture, because it was about a specific type of culture, and it was entering the gallery and museum culture rather than working in the community cultures or the community setups. And key to that was also the setting up of Innova as this holding pan of a type of culture that fits into British art culture.
And Shaheen, the next panel, which will feature Ghislaine Tawadros, the founding director of Innova, and Nima Purvaya-Smith, who was a curator at the Cartwright Hall, and Mark Miller from Tate, will be looking at that complex about the institutionalization of curating. But I wanted to, before we kind of move to, because I mean, I'm looking at the Google Docs and there are a load of questions coming in, guys, which we want to get through. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of go back to your artistic practices and ask you about the relation of your curatorial practice at that time to your studio practice, to your art. How did that evolve from your studio practice? And I'm just thinking about, for example, I mean, one of the points you made, Shaheen, which I think is well made and which is something that I've been interested in thinking about in terms of Black curating at that time, was the fact there was a plethora, and also, all of you described that, there was a plethora of practices, right? It wasn't just about hanging things on walls. It was about archiving, about documenting. It was about engaging with technologies of copying, etc. at the time. It was a range of activities, not just, which expands and explodes the kind of standard definition of curating, which I think has become institutionalized and professionalized, as Shaheen said. So I wanted to kind of bring it back to the studio, to art practice. And I would like to ask all of you, and I'll start with Hassan, you know, how did your curating work, for example, Hassan at 198, how did that articulate with and relate to your artistic practice?
My work has always been about discrimination. When I worked in Nigeria, it was about discrimination based on tribalism. When I came to London, it became discrimination based on race. And so it's always had that undertone to it. And the exhibitions I've always sort of favored to organize, have always taken on my sort of inclination towards those subject matters. And oftentimes, even up to the present day with the organization that I lead, the Society of, the Nigeria Art Society UK, most of the exhibitions tend to be, which is maybe deliberate or coincidental, tend to be about the issues that my art addresses. So an artist as a curator can often be so quite self-centered to an extent in terms of sort of propagating their own views as the sort of set of subject matter that they choose to curate. And I find that constantly, and I've often been reminded even by my colleagues, because sometimes I come up with some radical ideas that don't fit into their own aspirations for their own work. But so there's a very personal approach to it. And I think, in my view, impossible to detach yourself and your beliefs and your inclinations from your curatorial practice.
Thank you, Hassan. Rita, I mean, you talked about yourself as an accidental curator, and often in biographies that I've seen online of your work, you're described as an artist, an organizer, etc., not necessarily as a curator, but of course, you've curated exhibitions. I mean, how does curating sit within your studio practice?
Well, the thing is that I don't know how not to get involved, and which for good or ill. And so if something needs to be done, then I'm more, if I can't do it, then I will add support, or I will see how to do it. But my practice, I trained as a painter, but I guess with issues of race and feminism, it was who you use in your work. And so I've always done collaging, but I felt very uncomfortable about just collaging some person I didn't know. So I was lucky enough to have a family archive. So, and figured since they were my family, I had permission. And so using my family archive, I was putting myself or extended myself into the picture. And I think that by putting yourself in the picture, you end up having to take a different kind of responsibility. And just like being responsible for showing your work or others' work, you have to be responsible to talk about your work. And, I've met artists that say, oh no, I can't talk about my work. And you think, well, if you don't, somebody else will. And yes, maybe your art should talk for you, but it doesn't necessarily. And you don't have to be over explicit, but you also have to be able to look at where you're showing and look at what you're doing. And I think all of us have shared our curatorial experiences with other people. And that's, and I think that's very indicative of the three of us, is we didn't keep the knowledge to ourselves. We were always, we always wanted to share that experience and the good and the bad of it, but how empowering it is. It's empowering to make, but it's also empowering to show, and it's empowering to share knowledge. And hence the Panchayat and other archives.
Absolutely, Rita, and that kind of really chimes with the etymology of the word curating, which comes from curare, to care for, objects, to care for things. So that absolutely commits to that. Shaheen, I'd like to just, I mean, you, in a way, you know, your art practice, particularly around working with batik and other radical forms at the time and technologies, you know, morphed into, in a way, you became, you know, perhaps more than Hassan and Rita, you know, a curator, high profile curator, one of Europe's high profile galleries, head of exhibitions at the Haus der Kunst, which is, you know, a major gallery. And so again, where does your art practice sit within your curatorial practice? What's the relationship?
This is going to take about an hour to describe.
You have about 4 minutes, Shaheen.
All right. So, I mean, the idea of working as an artist and using batik, although I graduated doing sculpture in this country, was partly to try to displace the notion of the hierarchies that existed around mediums that came from the West and those that came from everywhere else, the rest of the world. Batik was very specific to the way that it was used in India, the way it was used in Indonesia, as well as in Latin America. And batik for me stood for a very specific way to create images and how those images could be seen to be created on cloth, which is the same as canvas, for instance. But the fact that you're creating that with wax and dyes rather than with paints deferred and took it completely, although the images remained the same. What I was trying to do to a certain extent was to be productive around knowledges which are outside of the West, or traditions, or materiality, which was outside of the West. That what you might be ending up is being in a secondary hierarchy, which is between the arts and the crafts. And a lot of artists ended up being, the Caribbean craft circle was really important because it had a profound number of artists, Black artists like George Farrakhan Kelly, who was a fantastic artist, brilliant portraitist, but because of who and how he works, found himself not termed as a sculptor, but as a craftsperson. And that was one way of not being able to make a partnership with the West because it relied on historicity. And that, in a sense, created questions about why we should be assertive about using our own sources and references. Now, what I think was very interesting about all of this as artists is that there was a lot of demands made of artists in the production of exhibition making. I mean, Eddie was on a roll, like, you know, he had sometimes 4 to 5 exhibitions on the go. And a number of artists were asked to be inventive and service those exhibitions. And they were in all different types of spaces in different parts of the country, and different types of museums and galleries, and sometimes in education sectors as well. And I think these were the sort of relevant facts that we have to deal with now, that through this curating and the way it formulated networks and the way that it created relationships between materials and methodologies have created long-term partnerships where you find the notion of those partnerships with materials, for instance, in Chris O'Feely's work, when he used an elephant dung, for instance, and pins and things like that. That was partly based on exhibitions and ideas which were germinating throughout the Black arts. And he was inflecting on that. Yinka and his use of kente and cloth was part already of that whole seminal growth of ideas which are outside of the West and Westernisms. So what I'm suggesting is that this first iteration of Black art that happened in Britain was a really important collective set of stimulated discussions, actions, commitments, activities, and activism, which led to this resurgence that we're having as in the second iteration through the BLM protests.
Great. Thank you so much, Shaheen there, and also to Hassan and Rita. So I guess we've got about 20 minutes or so left, and I think I can see from the Google Docs that there's quite a few questions that are coming up. So let's go to those, and I will try to read out some of those questions where people have indicated that they want, these questions. So the first question is from Pauline D'Souza. And she says, hearing how artists are speaking about their approaches to curating at times reflects the same approaches of artist curators of the 1960s in Europe and the UK. Can the panelists discuss these similarities and possible differences? So looking at, I guess, the approach of artist curators in the 1960s in Europe and the UK. Does anyone want to?
Well, I think to a degree, I mean, I know at the Brixton Art Gallery, it was a wide range of ages. So there you learn from other people, and putting work on walls or looking at a diverse making is you're trying to break down some of those structures, like hanging paintings with sculpture, with ceramics, to so you're looking at transgression, so things like fluxus and things that artists don't work outside of context, and they will know another artist who almost has a lineage of practice. So I guess once you decided to step away from the collector as curator, it became a self-help sort of space and practice.
Shaheen?
Yeah. You have to remember there were artists who were producing and working in this country, in Europe and abroad, like David Modella, very much central to what was going on in the 80s. They were not outside of it, they were part of it. So there was a collective voice. Gustav Mezza was another one. Those two walked around with plastic bags all around London and going to different exhibition spaces and studios. They were so involved. It's ridiculous, the amount of places there must have been, the conferences, the talks that they intervened and took place. So navigating was also with others who had a relationship, a real relationship with the 60s, and not a secondary one, of being and part of an understanding of what happened in Paris and other cities in Europe, as well as what was happening throughout Britain. So, and they also were curating. David set up the London Biennale and was always working with signals and ideas throughout his life, which set up incredible models for us to follow through. And I think what we did was we scaled up those models.
But also people like David showed at the Brixton Art Gallery.
Yeah.
When he discovered the Brixton Art Gallery, he was at home.
Absolutely.
So there is a continuity, even if we don't necessarily, even if it's an invisible continuity.
Yeah. Maybe not an invisible, an unrecorded, which is part of the history of this period, is that there was a division of resources that were given to non-European and European artists. And that division was unequal.
Yeah.
I think that curating has always been an artist, or the artist's area, and it was the artists who originated it. Without the artists, there would be no curating. I'm probably correct to say that. So artists have a need to show their work, to practice, and to sort of publicize their work. They have those needs. So curating is for the needs and the benefits of artists. And regardless of the time frame, regardless of the decade or era, there would definitely be similarities between that need in the 60s to the need in the 90s and 80s. So with that said, in the 80s, what we saw was the emergence of so very many more venues which didn't, and opportunities which didn't exist necessarily in the 60s, such as the Africa Center as a showing space, the Black Art Gallery, Westbourne Art Gallery, Bedford Hill Gallery, Brixton Art Gallery, 198 Gallery, Bonagri Gallery at the Commonwealth Institute, to name a few. So in the 60s, those spaces may or may not have been available to show. So artists such as Uzo Egonu, who was working then, had to find a different sort of forum to show his work, or maybe go international, for all I know. So in terms of the similarities or the differences between the artist-curator approach between the 60s and the 80s to 90s, Pauline, I presume that there are greater similarities than there are differences.
Great.
But also all those places you mentioned, how many exist today?
Many of them were not commercially viable. And when commerce became the requirement from Margaret Thatcher and possibly a few couple of governments after her, most of the spaces lost their funding and went under. Minorities Art Advisory Service, which published Outrage and Black Art in London, went down exactly the same way. And that was a huge also.
Okay, so there's a few questions that, thank you so much for that, folks. There's a few questions that focus on the kind of regional dimension of the question that we did kind of bring up. So there's a question from Carol Thompson. Wolverhampton Art Gallery just marks the 40th anniversary of Black Art Undone, which opened in June 1981. The curator at the time welcomed Eddie Chambers' proposal for the exhibition of highly political work by the Wolverhampton Young Black Artists Group, and it was well received in the city. Much of the discussion so far has been around activity in London, which I did point out in the earlier part of this, at the beginning of this project. I wonder whether the panel feel that there were more barriers to Black artists in London, in the capital at that time. Hold on before you go on. There's a couple of other questions that address that. So Nina Edge says, another wonderful artist, London-centric, Midlands, yes, but Liverpool, Cardiff, Rochdale, too. And Bristol. Do feel free to invite me to speak another time. And another question that deals with, no, okay, so really, yeah, so really just dealing with that kind of regional question. Was London, in a way, were there more barriers to London at the time, or what was the kind of regional context to this, just to clarify those questions?
Well, I know most of us showed around the country, given half a chance, but you might not necessarily be able to curate around the country. Whereas someone like Eddie or Keith that would have had those contacts would have been, I know that I did quite a few shows with Eddie and the Keith Piper, Trophies of Empire that showed outside. So quite often you would be able to show, as an artist, show outside of London, but you wouldn't necessarily have a London venue. So it's more than likely a wider variety of work got seen in places like Manchester, Liverpool, all of the major cities than actually did get London venues. So the major shows did not necessarily have London venues. So there was a certain way that outside of London, you were more likely to be facilitated and have almost a stronger art network, because we were, by the nature of London, we were so separated. And once the GLC and the Arts Council stopped, for good or ill, we didn't have conferences. We didn't have a way of meeting each other anymore, and that was very difficult from like the mid-90s onwards. We stopped speaking, but not because we wanted to, but you have to just get on. But I think that is that contact, that network that was started just diminished.
I mean, I graduated in Gwent, at Gwent College of Further Education as such, when it was known. That became Gwent College of Art, and now I think it's called something else. But anyway, in Newport. And I stayed 1 year after I graduated from my undergraduate studies in Newport, making work within the communities without any support, just by myself, because I felt very much embedded in that community. But one thing what people have to realize is that there was a significant network of artists who worked in a multicultural sector or multicultural education, which was all around the country. So there was AIMS, which was Art Education in Multicultural Society, and various other organizations which took artists to schools, colleges for up to sometimes 6 to 10 days at a spell to work with a particular focus on a particular school. And there might be 4 artists who were working together from different parts of the country. So there was a great amount of work which was done, in a sense, outside of London. Unfortunately, you got 3 people living in London and working in London on this panel, but there was an incredible circus, or a circuit rather. And I think the other thing which we have to take on board is that things like the Apna Arts Mela in Nottingham worked with a large amount of artists, including Said Drus, Bhajan Hunjan, myself, to produce, with Said produced some of the very large scale banners which were used for the concerts. And these were the first large scale works actually to be available by an artist of color in this country, when not in a gallery, not on boards, but in a Mela in Nottingham. And I know that both Said and Bhajan have worked extensively in Leicester, collaboratively working with community-based projects for over 2 decades. But again, where is the written histories of these artists' embeddedness? Yeah, in these urban environments, in these communities. And you also got to remember that something like Asian Dub Foundation produced a group called ADF Ed. So it was Asian Dub Foundation Education. And that comes out of their relationship working with the 2 folks at Dub Morphology, which is Gary Stewart and Trevor Matheson, to produce an education project really very much about embedding people who were interested in sonic landscapes, for instance. Again, a history which is unwritten, very much so.
Hassan, did you want to address this?
Sorry, I was muted again. I suppose that London was the landing place for my family, and that's the reason why when I came here, I came naturally to London. However, when I moved out of London to go to Dagenham, when I moved out of Battersea to move house to Dagenham more than 20 years ago, everybody who I told I was moving to Dagenham said, "Oh, why are you going there? It's very racist." So there's the perception that London is more cosmopolitan. It has more opportunities. It has more galleries. It has a bigger scene, and maybe perhaps it's more receptive. That might just be perception. However, I've been to Newcastle and I've seen the extensive provision of art facilities, spaces, and with an attitude that's very inclusive and multicultural. And I would imagine that perhaps maybe it's more for those emotional or other such reasons that London has been the sort of focal point for many of the activities, even if the biggest events or the a good number of the very landmarking, groundbreaking events have been outside of London. Personally, I have shown my work in the West Country, in Hereford, and it was a phenomenal exhibition.
Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes left, and there are too many questions for us to cover in this way. So what I'm going to say is, I'm going to summarize briefly what the questions are, and I'm going to work with Martin and the conveners to find a way that we can perhaps feed those questions to you, and then maybe see if we can get some answers to them on the website after this event. Just briefly, so there are questions around question from Hattie Spires to Rita about the international context and the Harlem Renaissance, and to unpack that. A question from Ananda Rutherford about curating 1980s and now, and the government agenda and rewriting of history and the resurgence of the right. A question from Nick Brown about about the previous generation and the questions around the Caribbean artist movement in the 60s and 70s, and what impact that had. A question from Chike Azorni, which is around how will Black artists help embrace so many artists, how many Black curators help artists that have been presently shunned by the British art establishment. A comment from Nina Edge about the hierarchy of media, focusing on Rita's presentation. A question from Narendra Pakede, who wanted to ask about political economy, and then from Dotan Agbite about when will we be talking about art rather than Black art. Again, thank you so much for your questions. We will find a way of feeding them to our panelists so that we can feed back on the website eventually when this material, all these materials will go onto the British Art Network website. We'll give you some details about that. For the last couple of minutes, 2 minutes, I want to just really go through all of our panelists to just maybe reflect on just a last statement about this question around the emergence of Black curatorial voices, of which you were important and signal agents. And I'm so blessed to have you really initiate this conversation in the best possible way. So just really briefly, I'll start with Shaheen, and then Rita, and then Hassan. Just a brief 50-second comment on what you take out of this and, you know, moving forward.
As a postscript, I think these were amazing times, and it's well overdue that these testimonies need to be embraced, and the textualities and the possibilities recorded, remembered, immortalized. There was a great deal of ambition in the pre-electronic, which can then form part of the digital domain as such. And I hope that that whole technosphere, which is about identity production, embraces this and takes it further. So that's my takeaway from this conversation.
Fantastic, thank you, Shaheen. Rita?
It is like Shaheen, it is exciting to actually be remembered, and that the work that you did actually has legs, and that, you know, there is a sadness that here we go again, but maybe with things like that, then we built on the backs, and we were helped up by our predecessors, and that we can go forward because we are allowed to see what's back, and that's what's important.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. Hassan?
We have a lot to be thankful to organizations like Obala, the African and Asian Visual Art Archive, the YBA, Zoe Linsley Thomas, and several other uncelebrated people who gave their time and passion, energy, and resources to creating this space whereby we now have that genre called the curator, who's looking in a specialist way at the work that people like me and a lot more other artists are doing presently in the UK. With this initiative of the British Art Network, hopefully this will be documented for generations to come to see where the current situation of the art world and cohesion generally, where it has emanated from, who were the people at the onset of that struggle. Thank you.
So thank you, Shaheen Merali, Rita Keegan, Hassan Aliyu, for sharing your brilliance, your knowledge, your archives, your expertise. This project, it will be an ongoing project. We will be doing other events and discussions and interviews around this. It's an area that I think will be opening up. As I said, what I wanted to do with this project is to focus on the voices of Black artists and curators, and the agency of that. And I think you amply demonstrated the importance of that. more questions are coming in even as we speak, so this is ongoing. I'd like to end with just thanking everyone for coming, but also to say next week on the 8th of July, the second panel will be taking place with the equally brilliant Ghislaine Tawadros, Nina Puvaya-Smith, and Mark Miller around the question of Black art in institutions. So thank you for coming to this first edition of Genealogies of Black Art, and take care. Thank you.